Well, Mike.
Hi.
Hi. We're getting so close to a lose day, aren't we?
Oh, we are. It's been, gosh, I feel like it's been 6 days since we've had one.
And I feel, sometimes I enjoy the anticipation of a lose day as much as a lose day itself.
It's like Christmas morning in a way. I mean, if Christmas morning were named after one of the hosts of this show. Of course,
Right on.
if Jesus was hosting this show, it would be more watched.
I would hope so. But it does make me interested in somehow manufacturing a resurrection of some kind.
Okay, well, most of your ideas off the cuff have really worked out well. So.
I feel attacked and enough that I'm just going to derail this and start the show.
Yeah, go ahead.
Welcome to hotlou Happy Hour. I am your host, Lou Abramowski, or somewhat conceptually known as hotlou.
I still don't have coronavirus, Mike Franklin.
No, but you are the one and only Mike Loaf.
Yeah, no, and I gotta say, this might turn into a thing. This kind of just came up, organically the other day with the, it's not a great time to do a bat out of hell reference as far as the aforementioned coronavirus pandemic, but our apprentice, I think is the term you usually use. I mean, just a bang up job. I mean, of taking the off the cuff bat out of hell reference and putting my little face on it. So like next time, maybe I won't be on the show. This bat could be your co-host, and it'd be almost like having me there.
Okay, well, next time you're going on vacation, which is
currently, yes, I'm currently actually on vacation, even though I'm sitting in my office right now doing work.
Yeah. And you know what, lunatics? I think you better appreciate this simulated version of Hot Mic 3, which is now evolved into Mike Loaf. Pretty impressive. So nice work, Alyssa, on that one. Because, the show has turned into, from what used to be 6 to 8 text messages of prep. Now it seems like maybe one.
Maybe one is the right answer. What are we going to talk about today, Lou? Usually is said when the Zoom has been fully engaged.
Yep, absolutely. Well, I think there's kind of two interesting things that happened as we kind of resumed the hotlou News Network. And we've gotten some feedback from a couple of the lunatics that they really appreciate your history in both political science and history itself, along with understanding the law with your law degree. So I thought it might make sense to talk about some more breaking news with the Supreme Court.
Yeah. And this is breaking news, so I don't really, I don't have a ton of sort of in-depth analysis here, but as is our tradition, every couple of years we have a Supreme Court case on abortion. This will just continue until it's either overturned or until Congress does its job and actually passes a law regulating this sticky subject. And I don't really want to get down a rabbit hole here about abortion because I value not having to defend my family from my erstwhile opinions. But this is a big deal. So as far as I could tell, I've read 2 stories on this. The state of Louisiana had a law in place that required abortion to be performed by a doctor who has admitting privileges at a nearby hospital. And it was ostensibly to protect the health and safety of the woman getting the abortion. I mean, I won't say much about the health and safety of the baby, but that's as far as I'll go. But as far as the law goes, well, as far as the votes go, it was a 5-4 ruling with Chief Justice Roberts joining the liberals. So the court, as it's been constituted for, gosh, a couple decades now, maybe even more, has basically been a 5-4 conservative, if you will, majority. But as we've talked about on the show, it doesn't always work like that. This is not a policy-making body, although it does it far too often. It's supposed to be interpreting the law, practicing deference to elected officials in Congress or in states that make these laws. But abortion is constantly a subject at the court, kind of precisely because the court in 1973 in Roe versus Wade, more or less from one person's opinion, actually from probably hundreds of millions of people's opinion, made up a constitutional right to an abortion. And as I usually say, you don't have a constitutional right to very much. The Constitution is not a document that gives you positive rights. The courts have done that over the years for various things, including now, for more than our lifetimes, to an abortion. And so states, through their elected officials, are constantly trying to chip away at this, either because they think that the state majorities think that it's a dangerous practice or that it's murder. Some people certainly hold that view. Or simply that this is not how we do law in this country. We're not supposed to have 9 men at that time just sort of read into the law what they wish was there and isn't. So anyway, in this case, Louisiana passed a law. I'm not sure when. Actually, I am sure when. It says it right on my screen, 2014. So it's about a 5.5, 6-year-old law. Got all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. The abortion proponents in this case claimed that this would be over broad to the point of basically outlawing abortion, as there would only be one clinic in the entire state that could adequately meet these criteria. But again, these cases are not supposed to be decided on the sort of the policy of it. You're not supposed that shouldn't matter, candidly. It should be sort of a function of, did the state have the power to do it? And is it consistent with past rulings, which is what brings us to the Chief Justice. So the Chief Justice 2 years ago or 3 years ago voted in favor of restricting abortion rights, if you want to term it that way, in Texas, which had passed apparently a virtually identical law. So that law met with a 5-4 demise. And in that case, Roberts voted with the conservatives. Now, in this case, he flipped. Why did he flip? Well, according to him, and this was always, so if you're just want to put people in categories, this was always the concern when not only Roberts but Kavanaugh was appointed to the court. If what you care about is somebody that's going to overturn Roe versus Wade, neither of those two gentlemen ever really seemed like that kind of person, because of the concept of stare decisis, which is a fancy legal word which basically means our past decisions should hold. Throughout its history, the Supreme Court has been very, very, very reluctant to overturn itself. It's obviously happened. I mean, Brown versus the Board of Education, right? And other, Obergefell, which more or less made gay marriage legal across the whole country, despite the fact that many, many states were going that direction anyway. And abortion is one where there's a lot of pressure on the court to overturn itself, to overturn Roe versus Wade. My strong suspicion is that will happen someday, because it's just god-awful law. I mean, it's really, really bad law. It's been upheld now consistently with some restrictions. It's been a long time since I've really read up on this, but there was a case in the 90s called Casey, which was a Pennsylvania case, which did give the states a little more leverage than they had from 1973 to whatever, 1995 or 6, whatever year it was. But now this case it's a big deal. I mean, it's a big deal because I think probably from a superficial basis, people looked at this case. It's in the Supreme Court. There's 5 conservatives on the court. Therefore, it's gone. And I think that the people who, I'm sure including many, many lunatics who think that abortion should be legal are probably cheering a lot today, because it will remain legal in theory as long as these five justices serve together on the court. However, you should be careful about just assuming that this is another policymaking body, because it's another state, and I'm sure there's as many as 50 states, or right, still 50, right? Did we add DC over the weekend? I'm not sure.
There's a push for it.
I know there is. They're constantly.
Yeah.
But anyway, I'll just wrap up, because I'm on the Hot Mic 3 bat out of hell soapbox here. But this was, as far as I can tell, and again, I've read 2 articles, so I've not read the case, I've not read any of the analysis here, but this was decided, as it should be, on basically legal and constitutional matters. And Justice Roberts flipped, in part because the Texas case is now precedent. And so Justice Roberts said, more or less said, I don't like this. I don't like this policy, but we uphold the principle of stare decisis, and that case is the law now that we've decided. And so I'm not going to overturn it because I don't happen to like it, which, it puts conservatives in an interesting box, because that's sort of what we want out of our Supreme Court justices, right? They're going to uphold the law that is, whether or not they like it. We want judges that call balls and strikes. You hear that in every Supreme Court nomination hearing. And in this case, that's what Justice Roberts did. Unless you subscribe to the principle that the ultimate goal here should be eradicating bad law from our doctrine. And most attorneys, I think, believe that Roe versus Wade is bad law. Whatever you think of the outcome, whatever you think of what it accomplishes, it is a poor case and is really rickety. And that's why you're going to continue to see it challenged. That and a lot of other reasons.
Yeah. I'll admit that was my favorite Mike Loaf box segment in the history of hotlou Happy Hour.
Be careful.
Yeah, that's true. But because I have to admit, like, I'm in the camp of the lunatics that enjoy this part of the show, because I learned so much off of just hearing what I think probably your casual American thinks of as, especially with Roe v. Wade in the Supreme Court. I think probably most people think of the Supreme Court as kind of tied to this Roe v. Wade decision. And like that makes up 90% of their understanding of the Supreme Court.
Yep.
And as we talked to the people who a couple weeks ago from the Institute for Justice, they're, them talking to the Supreme Court justices, or the Supreme Court in general. And then the ruling last week about sex discrimination and how it was about being literally interpreting the law as sex discrimination and not really necessarily about making a value judgment about a gay person or not.
Right.
I think this translates into kind of what you're saying I'm just going to call it the Stare DeSantis decision.
He's the governor of Florida, or it might be.
That's probably his cousin. That a lot of it is just looking at precedent or understanding of whether or not the law itself is constitutional, and actually not bringing in these kind of secondary value systems to try to apply to what you might think like ethically or personally or emotionally about it. But it's about their own like value system as it relates to interpreting and applying the policies that other people have made.
And it's really important. So the court, we could do a whole show. The court is a fascinating, probably our most fascinating institution, because what the Constitution says about the court is not very much. So just about every power that we give the court has been taken by the court over time, all the way back to the most famous case is Marbury versus Madison, which was Justice John Marshall, who served for over 20 years as the Chief Justice, back in a time when things were very partisan, right? We can't even imagine such a time. But at that time, the Justice Marshall more or less made up the right of constitutional review, and the Congress and the president at that time, Thomas Jefferson, accepted the logic, because Marshall brilliantly gave the new president, who was from the other party, Jefferson was a Republican and Marshall was a Federalist, gave him what he wanted, but in doing so struck down the law that allowed it to happen in the first place. And so it was kind of like half a loaf. And then over time, see what I did there?
Yeah.
Over time, that judicial review, which is not anywhere to be found in the Constitution, just became accepted as practice. That when there's a dispute between the other two branches, that the Supreme Court is where we, or between a state and the federal government, this is how we resolve such things. It's really, I love this. My favorite part of law school was, as is probably most lawyers, was con law, because constitutional law, because the court just makes shit up, and very often very often they are trying to achieve a result, but the most useful way that the court, to a judicial conservative, to a legal conservative, the most important thing the court can do is nothing. is to let the elected officials decide policy. And whatever you think of it, whatever you think of gay marriage or abortion or affirmative action is a doctrine that gets challenged all the time. The reason they get challenged all the time, and why we're every couple of years having to analyze a new Supreme Court case on abortion, is specifically because there's a whole bunch of people in this country who think that these things should be settled by people with election certificates, by politicians who have, and we talked about this with the Institute for Justice folks, who have for 50 years plus, or maybe longer, just totally abdicated their responsibility to govern. And if the election turns out in November how we think it might, and there's a new president who's a Democrat, and very likely if that happens, a Senate that's controlled by the Democrats, I won't like this based on the policy, but boy, it might be good for the country, for the Congress and the new president to just pass a law dealing with abortion once and for all. And that law will be challenged in the Supreme Court as well, but at least you'll have the imprimatur of Congress and the president on it, which will make it a lot stronger.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's fascinating that I'm learning about this whole thing, and I can hopefully sit in the seats of the lunatics as they're listening to this whole thing, is that I think what I kind of casually understood, let's say a year ago, and now I understand a little bit better. And ironically, one of the reasons that I understand this a little bit better is because of I think the previous huge Netflix documentary that wasn't crazy. It was crazy for different reasons. What it was called, like Making a Murderer.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And understanding that for things to reach the Supreme Court, it's not like you start a GoFundMe and a change.org petition to get the Supreme. You could,
but you have to have a dispute. You have to have a dispute that involves a lower court at some point, or a state and the federal government kind of thing.
Right, exactly. The dispute needs to either be only resolvable through the Supreme Court where it had originated, or it needs to start somewhere at a very lower court and continuously be escalated, which can take years.
Yeah, absolutely, and frequently does. But states will provoke this. I mean, I don't know this. I'm not a Louisianan. I'm just a lunatic. But my suspicion is that when the legislature and governor of Louisiana passed this law, they knew damn well that this was more or less provoking a Supreme Court review. And
that's exactly what
innovate.
Yeah, and exactly where I was headed is sometimes these things are just manufactured deliberately, knowing that there's the opportunity then to escalate into the Supreme Court, because that's the path that you get there when the change.org only gets 100,000 signatures.
And as we discussed with the IJ folks, I mean, the court can say no. The court doesn't have to review this. But that in itself can sometimes be all you need. So if the court in this case had just said, we're not going to hear this case, Louisiana could continue to do what it wanted. Assuming, I'm not sure actually, I should have been paying more attention to this, but so legislature and governor pass a law, it goes to federal court. So somebody will sue in federal court, you'll get in front of a judge, you make your argument, the judge rules one way or the other. And I'm not sure exactly which path this took. Then that's appealed. It goes to a circuit court of appeals. And so I think that the circuit court here, which whatever district that is, must have ruled in favor of the the pro-abortion side, or at least I think, which they should, based on, because appeals courts are actually literally bound by this precedent. So regardless of what they feel on the issue,
yeah, and that's where
Supreme Court says we're not doing this, then the appeals court has to say, I'm sorry, we're bound.
Yeah, and that's where I was going to head with this next thing, because I think some people think that just by having a Republican president and Senate, that would then appoint a Supreme Court justice who does politically lean towards the right and maybe is against abortion, doesn't actually translate to automatically creating a law that makes it illegal. There are a bunch of steps that need to go into that process. And I think historically we've kind of seen from what I know about the Supreme Court justices is they need to be persuaded by a legal argument.
Absolutely.
That overrules any maybe previous precedent or a previous misinterpretation, or maybe not even misinterpretation, but a shift in value system. But as we learned with Chief Justice John Roberts, that in his opinion, it's like, even if you don't like it, the law argument wasn't made. So even appointing an entire Supreme Court filled with a bunch of anti-abortion Supreme Court justices doesn't necessarily translate into making abortion illegal.
You can parse it out. I mean, you can be I don't think many people are, but you can be pro-abortion and anti-Roe versus Wade. I mean, I think a lot of lawyers would fall into that category because it is just such a messy, like I said, rickety ruling. I mean, it's just on such specious legal grounds that I suspect there are a fair amount of lawyers who are pro-abortion but anti-Roe versus Wade. And if that, let's say that Trump is reelected and Ruth Bader Ginsburg retires and Justice Breyer retires, and now there are 7 conservative justices on the court, right? To your point, it doesn't necessarily mean that Roe would go away. I mean, it makes it much more likely that Roe would go away, but you probably have people, I mean, you have Roberts, and you probably have Kavanaugh, that are both of the mindset that stare decisis matters, and we should, regardless of what we feel about it, we should just defer. We should defer to our past rulings. And now, I don't think that would happen, but let's say that nightmare scenario presents itself, and Trump is there, and Mitch the Turtle McConnell is still the Senate Majority Leader, and they cram through 2 more. Let's say it's me, right? I'm on the court. No, let's not use me.
We can hope.
Targeted. We could hope. Amy Coney Barrett was a woman who was the anti-abortion crowd was hoping would be on the court by now. Let's say she gets on the court. And Roe versus Wade is cast, and Casey are put into the dustbin of history, and the court is now just silent on the question of abortion. My strong suspicion is that most states would pretty quickly, or the federal government, I mean, well, under that scenario, there's still Republicans in charge, so maybe not, but most states would probably pretty quickly pass, if they don't already have them, permissive laws about abortion. And from the sort of the way we govern ourselves perspective, that is, to me, that is the way it should be done. That our local governments should have more of an oar in the water when it comes to these decisions. But over generations, they don't want to, because if you take a position on something controversial, there's a likelihood that people might disagree with you, and then they might vote against you.
Has that been known to happen?
I can imagine.
Yeah, I think the big takeaway for the lunatics, hopefully, kind of as I'm digesting this too, is that, that even landing in this place where maybe you have a bunch of Supreme Court justices who might not align with your political value system, if nothing reaches them ever, it's not going to overturn the things that you might disagree with. And even if it does, if the argument to overturn that kind of stuff is not actually persuasive enough, or you have people who believe in Stare DeSantos. It's going to remain that way for kind of a long time.
I'd like to think that Stare DeSantos, the governor's cousin, is like a relief pitcher. You know, like he's good, and maybe like a minor league relief pitcher. Like he's not going to be on the Tampa Bay Rays, but like he might be in the Durham Bulls or something like that. Stare DeSantos now coming out of the bullpen, left-hander, 29-year-old Stare DeSantos. My cartoon bubbles on overdrive. I think it's this damn bat.
It could be. I thought for sure you were going to go down the porn star route.
Oh, no,
the president.
Like that. I feel like I've been controversial enough today without bringing in stars.
Yeah, and I'm trying to bring you back and put you back on the Mike Loaf box. Okay. So the other thing that I want to talk about really briefly, because now that we can get back into my wheelhouse, the internet. So some people may have seen that a subreddit on the site reddit.com has now been banned, along with about 2,000 others. And that subreddit is called The Donald. It is a subreddit that has been very supportive of Donald Trump for several years and has, and let me back up for a second, because I find it kind of surprising that Reddit still continues to be like this fringe, or in people's mind, it's this fringe internet site. But the last time I checked, and maybe we'll have our fact-checking team, which we don't we don't give enough tasks lately to, but that site, I think, is like number 8 in the United States. And yet somehow it escapes all of the same criticisms that you see Facebook just getting crushed with. And, you know, I wonder a lot, and it goes back to our conversation on Friday about like endorsing my political opponent and making kind of dumb political decisions. But Facebook has almost always taken a very upfront approach and like, you know, voluntarily going before Congress to testify, you know, and trying to get ahead of these things. Whereas like Reddit and Twitter and Google, I think like are taking the Joe Biden approach that like their competition is out there being loud and making mistakes left and right. And they, by their very nature and their silence, get to elevate their public perception the same way Biden just is not doing anything right now. And Trump just screws up left and right. And his numbers keep going up. We might not even hear from Biden until he's inaugurated next January.
Yeah, it's a strong possibility. Why would you speak? Why would you mess this up?
But in any case, Reddit is, you know, potentially like one of the most dangerous parts of the internet to fuel a bunch of misinformation. And in my opinion, I can't remember if I've said it on the show or on Reddit itself or in like a Facebook post, but Reddit is made up of all of these sub-communities. Okay, so everything that gets published onto Reddit actually is part of a greater community. And within those communities, there are moderators, and people call them mods for short. And then there is a small group of employees at Reddit. And I want to say Reddit's entire staff is still just in the dozens, which is kind of crazy to think. But they only got a handful of admins still that kind of can supersede some of the moderators. But the idea is that the moderators are going to be the one that control, by and large, that subreddit community. And you can only upvote or downvote content or comment on it. And Reddit does a really good job algorithmically to see when there's vote manipulation happening. But what they can't do is when there's a human impersonating somebody who takes a position, jumping into the conversation to either derail it or fuel misinformation. And they really rely a lot on just humans, like we had with David Strum a few weeks ago. And, you know, Facebook groups is the analog of Reddit, that sure, you can create these closed private groups that from the outside you can't actually get into. And then
not being a Reddit person, is that what this Trump thing was? It was kind of a closed group, if you want to think of it that way?
It started out as a wide open group, and slowly but surely things would happen that the group would break rules. So some of the rules for Reddit, for example, is you can't post something in your subreddit to say there was a post in another subreddit, and you need everybody to go in and downvote all of the things that you disagree with. It's called brigading. So you like get a whole bunch of people to go manipulate something that's happening in another group.
Okay.
So by default, when you sign up for Reddit, you subscribe to a handful of subreddits, and then your homepage is just like Facebook, but instead of your friends posting, it's strangers who post in these groups that you're subscribed to.
Okay.
And then the algorithm lets things bubble up to the top, and and then you can leave some groups, but you're by default subscribed to something like 27 of the most popular groups, or subreddits. So the Donald was one of those groups, and what will happen occasionally is...
I'm just trying to think this through, because again, I have not spent on Reddit. So you're talking, so sometime back in 2015, some of Donnie's friends or some of his supporters went on the Reddit and started the Donald, and like invited some of their friends, and then it just grew and grew and grew. Got it. Okay.
And then occasionally, if a post within a group that somebody is not subscribed to gets popular enough, it can bubble up into this other subreddit called It's Just All. So it's everything that's on Reddit. If it gets popular, it'll go in there. But if the group contains adult content or starts breaking a bunch of the rules enough that some of the content's like objectionable, then it gets what's called like quarantined.
Okay.
So that stuff won't reach all anymore. And sometime last year, because the 2 previous years, the Donald subreddit figured out how to game the system and make it into the all category. And after breaking a bunch of those rules and circumventing some of them, it got quarantined, which came across as a very censorship approach.
Sure.
And in fact, I'm forgetting some of the details, but around that time, and I think it was related to this, the founder and former and then now current again CEO of Reddit, Steve Huffman, was seeing that people were criticizing him in I think it was in the Donald, and he was going in and he had admin access to like the full database of Reddit, and he was editing their comments to go from Yeah, and it was a huge, like, this is something that I would think, in my opinion, is the type of, like, deserves a congressional hearing.
Oh, sure. I mean, like we talked about at one point during the show, I mean, the sort of the distinction between being a publisher and a forum, right? I mean, that would be a great example of a forum becoming more or less like a newspaper, which would fall under, now you need to be regulated like a newspaper. So that's
and
really
think of a newspaper editor changing a comment from somebody, like take the president or a local official, and publishing it as if it was that person's comment. That's what happened, and he didn't lose his job. And his apology was that he thought he was just doing it as a prank.
Oh, sure.
I'm over summarizing it, but that was his excuse. And
wow, that's
wild. and he got away with it. And of course, because Reddit is still considered this like subculture of America, or this fringe site, but it is incredibly powerful, and it's really, I'm finding it to be very easy to be manipulated, and especially on the qualitative side, right? Like, how do you even prevent a human being who might be impersonating a Second Amendment right, or an anti-abortion or abortion, or vice versa? Just that qualitative side of it is very difficult to manage. And in my opinion, Reddit hasn't done enough to do that, even though they claim to be doing that. And then their CEO got caught red-handed editing other people's comments about himself and didn't lose his job. Wow. So anyway,
that's pretty wild.
Yeah, maybe we can do a whole show on that another time. And I probably got a couple of the details wrong there, but today they announced that they're actually completely banning about 2,000 subreddits as a result of a rule change. And the foundation of the rule change here, and I'm quoting here from The Verge, and I'll share the screen here, was that the big rule change that was super important here, I thought I had it right on my screen, but um, oh gosh, where did it go? Uh, was that it was basically the whole thing. The new policy starts with remember the human. And I can't believe I don't see it. I wonder if I'm looking at the, in any case, that's
Maybe
what
Reddit guy went in and edited it out, the part that you were looking for. It stands for reason.
Huffman's out there editing the Verge's. Yeah. In any case, the Donald has unsurprisingly been a very controversial group because Reddit has taken a very free speech is important type of approach. But with this new policy change that remember the human, and it was really, the policy changes were really about ensuring the safety of the community. And like I said, remembering the human, and it boils down to a high level of hate speech coming out of the group, along with a high level of the number of rules being broken in the group. And now it's been banned, which the people on the train, on the like social media networks are censoring conservative groups on the internet. This will fuel them a little bit. And I'm very curious to see if this will elevate Reddit into the conversation around this stuff. But I suspect because people don't understand Reddit that it's going to continue to fly really under the radar when it's a really, really big deal.
Well, I as I've now said several times, I don't really know much about the Reddit, but I pulled up StarTribune.com and it's one of the top stories on there. So it is being covered. It does seem like it's being seen as a big deal. I just, this whole, it's Jonah Goldberg, who I've been a fan of for many years at this point. I actually met him. We brought him in to do a speech here, I don't know, before he was a big deal. I mean, he wrote a column today that referred to this moment we're in as almost Maoist, that, when the young communists took over for the old communists, they set about just deleting everything and sort of censoriously going around, and it didn't even matter what was the content of it. It was bad because it was old. And it was kind of the point Jonah was making, is that we seem to be living in that moment, where
I have to interrupt you, because one of the things that I've seen in the last week and a half is a ton of Venezuelans talking about that transition into communism, that one of the big signals that people argued about, and eventually the people who were fighting against that communist movement, was that they were tearing down statues.
Yeah.
And that seems to be this potential signal, and not understanding the processes behind it. And just because you're angry about the existence of it, just tearing it down extrajudiciously.
I wonder how that would sound in Venezuelan Spanish.
Well, if there's a Venezuelan lunatic out there, we'd love to talk to you.
Wow. Yeah. Well, it's another, having just learned about this moments ago, the Reddit thing, Lou, I consider this the internet version of tearing down a statue you don't like.
It feels a little bit like that. And it's really interesting that, it's interesting because it was really a rule change, right? So this was this was Congress changing the rules, and then the Department of Justice came in and then applied the policy to get rid of the group. So they had been following kind of the rules, although they'd been breaking them occasionally, but not warranting getting deleted. So then maybe they went in and changed the rule that was hopefully constitutional, and that the Supreme Court. I don't know.
You're digging here.
I know. Before I put together these analogies, I should actually write them down, because every time I do it on the show live, it doesn't work out.
That's all right. All I know is I have a cartoon bat that is my new buddy. He sits right on my shoulder. Here he is.
All right. Well, how about this? I'll take some real time to put together an actual analogy. But suffice to say, as the rules change, I think it's going to be harder and harder across all these social networks to apply your free speech when it is objectionable content. And it'll be very interesting to see where that fine line between, is it okay to burn a flag or punch a Nazi or fly a Nazi flag or a Confederate flag and consider it free speech? Or do we start silencing all these people because we find it objectionable? And where does that head? Where we decide those things?
Well, exactly. I mean, I wonder sometimes the state of the folks who are analyzing all this alongside me, having grown up somebody who believed that the cure to speech that you don't like was more speech. We seem to have turned a corner, and I'm not sure that most of my neighbors believe that anymore. And my fear is that leads you to a very dark place. And I mean, you mentioned Venezuela. I mean, Venezuela was one of the most prosperous countries in the world, and it is now a place where you are fighting over the dog you found in the street to eat. And that all happened in about a generation. I mean, that wasn't a very long transition into the gutter. And we're not Venezuela, but gosh, the veneer of civilization is pretty thin.
Yeah, and we don't know what 20 years from now, when potentially there are bigger other crazy climate change problems or nuclear warfare problems that could then make those things change. So what a good way to potentially go on such a positive note.
I gotta go watch The Handmaid's Tale. That'll happen pretty quickly too.
I'm gonna go watch Tiger King again and celebrate how much cooler I am than a bunch of meth addicts in the middle of Oklahoma or wherever they're at.
That's a good standard to judge yourself by.
Yeah, why not? All right, that's going to do it for today's Hot Lou Happy Hour. Thanks for tuning in. It's going to be a kind of stop and start week here with a holiday where we celebrate this great country that we live in.
Oh, heavens.
I'm going to be very interested if the All Lives Matter people on Saturday this week are going to start celebrating that all countries' independence matter. I have a feeling they won't.
Logically consistent.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, everybody, for tuning into today's Hot Lou Happy Hour. I am your host, Lou Abramowski.
I am amateur court watcher with a bat, Mike Franklin.
And we'll talk to you on Tuesday.